When I returned from the bathroom, I saw my wife fleeing out the back with her lover. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an impression. It wasn't a hug between friends, nor an innocent farewell. It was an escape. A betrayal in motion. And the cruelest thing of all. Her stifled laughter, the sparkle in her eyes, as if she were escaping a prison, our house. Our home. I ran after them without thinking. My feet moved on their own, not on impulse, but on instinct. For a love that still burned in my chest even after being destroyed by a single blow. When I reached them in the side garden, she froze. Time stood still with her. Her lover, a coward who hadn't even dared to look me in the eye, remained silent. She looked at me as if she'd never known me. As if I were merely a shadow of the past that insisted on projecting itself onto the bright future she'd imagined. I said only one thing: you made your choice. Now face the consequences. And I turned away. Because in that moment, I understood, there was nothing there that was still mine. And there began the loudest silence of my life. The silence of a screaming absence. The silence of someone who still loves, but chooses to leave out of self-love. Because it's not just about being betrayed. It's about being discarded. Of being relegated to the background. Of realizing that someone who shared your life with you, who knew your laughter, your fears, your naked soul, chose another path as if your story were a chapter she'd rather not reread. She believed she was trading a dull routine for intense passion. That she was abandoning the too certain for something that would make her heart race. Perhaps she thought I would never have the courage to leave her for good, that I would beg, that I would fight for her. Perhaps she was enchanted by a reflection of what she lacked: adventure, danger, novelty. But novelty grows old, danger hurts, and adventure, when built on lies, takes its toll sooner or later. Days later, her lover disappeared. No messages, no explanations. He evaporated from her life as if he'd never existed. She was left with the echo of the promises she heard whispered in the dark. With the coldness of mornings when she woke alone, waiting for a message that never came. She was left with the shame of someone who betrayed her and wasn't even chosen. With the bitter taste of freedom gained at the cost of a true love she scorned. I silently rebuilt my life. No grand speeches. No social media. No posts about overcoming obstacles. Just silence and steady steps. It hurt. It hurt a lot. But every morning I woke up alone was also a chance to relearn how to live without someone who didn't want me. I learned to enjoy the sound of my own breathing. I learned to cook for myself. To sleep without the other side of the bed filled. And it was like that, between long nights and gray days, that I discovered a new love. A different love. Calm. Secure. One that didn't promise eternity, but gave me presence. One that didn't make theatrical declarations, but held my hand firmly in the moments I needed it most. A love that didn't need to be shouted, because it was felt in silence. Loyalty. Peace. Presence. And it was just when my heart was at peace that she tried to come back. With teary eyes, a trembling voice, saying she made a mistake, that she regrets it, that she wanted to start over. I listened. Silently, as I had from the beginning. I heard every word, every excuse, every sentence filled with guilt and regret. And all I could offer was forgiveness. I won't start over. Because sometimes, forgiveness is the only way to move on. And moving on doesn't mean going back. She saw in my eyes that there was no more room. And that's the true punishment for those who betray, realizing that the love that was once yours now belongs to another world. A world where you no longer have a key, nor an invitation. Where you can only peer through the window, imagining what it would have been like if you hadn't traded everything for an empty promise. She believed she could retrace her steps, but she discovered that time waits for nothing. And that some hearts, once broken, never return to the same hands. And on the day I remarried, she was there. Not by invitation, but by chance. Her footsteps crossed mine in front of the church. She wore a simple dress, her hair tied up haphazardly, her eyes tired. She stopped on the sidewalk when she saw me, the bride beside me, the guests smiling in the background, and me holding the rings. She smiled. A sad smile, the kind that hurts more than a scream. And, for the first time, I saw in her eyes what I'd been waiting to see since the day of the betrayal, true remorse. But it was too late. Because love, when it leaves, rarely returns to the same place. And if it does, it no longer finds anyone waiting. She lost me the very moment she believed I would stay. She lost me when she thought I was as predictable as habit. She lost me when she mistook stability for monotony. And now, all she has is the emptiness of impulsive decisions and the echo of my absence. But not everything has been said. Not everything has been revealed. Because there is one last truth. One last scene she will never forget. And that scene changed everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never romanticize or condone any form of cheating. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they reflect hard truths from real life, and serve as a warning. Because cheating destroys more than a relationship, it destroys trust, a future, and true love. Get ready for an intense, profound, and unforgettable story. Take a deep breath. What comes next will leave you speechless. Daniel met Emily on an autumn afternoon that promised nothing more than the ordinary. There was a quiet tranquility about everything that surrounded them in that beginning, as if the universe had decided, for a brief moment, to align two lives that until then had no reason to intersect. There were no immediate promises, no explosive enchantments. But there was calm. That rare calm that only exists when two souls recognize each other, even without understanding how or why. He was stable, centered, the kind of man who thinks before acting, who prefers to listen rather than speak, but who carries a hidden intensity in his gaze. Emily was light. Not in the naive sense of the word, but that light that enters through a crack in the window and changes the mood of an entire room. She had a slight smile, but her eyes carried stories. She was the kind of woman who walks firmly, but silently harbors some insecurities hidden behind her resolute posture. Their beginnings were simple. Quiet walks, long conversations into the wee hours, shared movies on the couch, hands leisurely reaching for each other. The two fit together almost imperceptibly, like two puzzle pieces that don't scream perfection, but together, make sense. Daniel's youth was marked by shallow relationships, while Emily's had a more intense history, with relationships that began in flames and ended in ashes. What brought them together was precisely their contrast. He anchored her, she moved him. And in that unlikely balance, they built a routine that, to outsiders, seemed peaceful, secure, and happy. The decision to live together came after 2 years of dating. The apartment wasn't large, but it had everything they needed. Every piece of furniture held a story, every object had a touch of both. The shelf with his books shared space with the abstract paintings she loved so much. The small kitchen was the scene of simple dinners, but filled with laughter, silly arguments, and apologies made between sips of wine. The bedroom was their refuge, with dim lighting, the scent of lavender, and sheets that always seemed too clean to be real. There was no luxury, but there was care. A care that can't be bought, that can't be faked. The care of those who choose to stay even when there's no party, even when silence descends. Daniel was a civil engineer, methodical, with a mind far too organized for such a chaotic world. He liked to make lists, plan his day, double-check every email before sending it. He was a man of routine, but also of clear intentions. When he promised something, he delivered. When he said he loved her, he showed it in small gestures, the coffee left on the table, the coat draped over her shoulders on cold nights, the way he held her hand in a crowd. Emily, on the other hand, worked with art. She painted, created, lost herself in canvases and paints for hours. Her world was made of sensations, colors, impulses. She was sensitive to the nuances of her surroundings, to the unspoken words, to the gestures many ignored. She lived more with her heart than with her head. And because of this, she often felt out of place in Daniel's more calculated universe. But she never felt diminished. On the contrary, she felt safe. He made her believe it was possible to be loved even on gray days. Their friends gradually blended in. Sunday lunches, birthdays celebrated together, impromptu trips with the car packed with suitcases and laughter. His family treated her with affection, and her parents saw him as a trustworthy man, someone their daughter could trust without fear. Everything seemed to flow naturally, unhurriedly, without rushing. The wedding, when it came, was an extension of their existing life. An intimate celebration, among close friends and emotional family. Nothing grand, but meaningful. Daniel cried when he saw her walk in. Emily's hands trembled as she held the rings. In that ceremony, there were promises that went beyond the words spoken at the altar. There was the silent promise of two worlds trying to balance each other, despite their differences. Early in their marriage, living together brought its natural challenges, his habits that irritated her, like excessively folding clothes or wanting to plan even the weekends, and her forgetfulness, sudden mood swings, and creative disorganization that scattered paint and brushes throughout the house. But between arguments and reconciliations, there was affection. There was still affection. And this sustained their daily lives. Sundays still began with pancakes he made and coffee she brewed. At night, he would sometimes lie on the living room floor to watch her paint in silence. Emily, in turn, loved listening to him talk about projects, even though she didn't understand the first thing about math. They still touched each other affectionately, still exchanged messages throughout the day, still laughed at inside jokes no one else would understand. But over time, the silence began to lengthen between them. Not a silence filled with hurt or suppressed screams. It was a more subtle, colder silence. An empty space between a question and an answer. A distracted look as the other spoke. They began to spend more time occupied with their own worlds than sharing the same one. Daniel immersed himself in work, in spreadsheets and reports, returning home exhausted, with no time for long conversations. Emily, feeling increasingly alone, took refuge in the studio she had set up in the guest room, where she spent hours painting, sometimes forgetting about time. Conversations diminished. Hands stopped seeking each other so often. Kisses became quicker. Hugs became more formal. Love still existed, but it was quiet, dormant under the dust of the same days. Still, he looked at her tenderly. Even in his fatigue, even in his routine, there was still admiration. She, on the other hand, was beginning to lose herself in questions. Not for lack of love, but for an excess of doubts. She began to wonder if this was the right path, if this kind of relationship was enough. She felt trapped in a version of herself she no longer recognized. She missed something she couldn't name. And this feeling, so difficult to translate, began to spread through her gestures, through words spoken with less conviction, through eyes that no longer shone with the same things. It was as if something inside her was beginning to fade. Like an old painting slowly losing color. Daniel noticed, but couldn't name it. He tried to recapture the sparkle in the details, a surprise dinner, a short trip, flowers left at the studio door. Emily smiled, thanked him, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Something in her was beginning to drift away, as if her soul were searching for something beyond the walls of that home. But she didn't say it. And he didn't ask. Because sometimes, the fear of hearing the answer is greater than the desire to understand what's happening. The surrounding scenery remained unchanged. The quiet neighborhood, the same old cafes, the friends who still saw them as a balanced, stable couple, the role model. No one understood the cracks. Not even them, perhaps. Because when you love someone, it's easier to believe everything will work out. That it's just a phase. That everything will soon return to normal. Daniel still made plans for the future. Still talked about children, about moving house, about renovations. Emily listened, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She still loved him. But maybe I didn't love him the same way anymore. Between dirty paintbrushes and silent dinners, between unreturned phone calls and postponed conversations, what was once a solid construction began to become uncertain ground. There was still no betrayal, no goodbyes. But there was distance. A distance measured not in meters, but in suppressed sighs and averted glances. And it is in this kind of emptiness that, sometimes, stories begin that should never have been written. It was an ordinary night, one of those where everything seems to be going as it always has, that everything fell apart. The house was silent, except for the sound of the shower echoing in the hallway. Daniel had gotten up to get a glass of wine while Emily said she'd take a quick shower. Dinner had been lukewarm, not because of the food, but because of the lack of conversation. She'd been strange for weeks, more introspective, more absent, as if something inside her was always far away, even when her body remained there. He noticed, but didn't question it. Partly out of fear, partly out of exhaustion. And in that moment, he just wanted to try one more time to make the night light. He walked to the kitchen with slow steps, felt the cold floor under his feet, opened the bottle, poured both glasses, and returned to the living room. He sat on the sofa, staring at the closed bathroom door. He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about saying something nice when she left. Maybe reminiscing about old times. Maybe just listening to her more attentively. But then, her cell phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a habit she'd recently developed, leaving her phone there, out of sight, to rest her mind. But Daniel knew better. He knew she was protecting something. The phone vibrated more and more. 1, 2, 3 messages. All with the same name on the screen. A name he'd never seen before. A name that wasn't part of their circle. And what broke everything wasn't curiosity, it was urgency. The last notification said, "Sorry for disappearing. Can we talk today? I miss you." Daniel felt his blood run cold. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. His heart didn't race, he didn't scream, he didn't throw a tantrum. He just stood there, motionless, staring at those words. As if each letter was a blow to his chest. He stood up slowly, picked up his cell phone carefully, as if carrying something fragile, and walked toward the bathroom. The water was still running. He knocked on the door twice. Not violently, but firmly. Emily replied, surprised, that she was already leaving. But he opened the door anyway. Steam filled the hallway. Startled, she quickly covered herself with the towel, her eyes wide. The cell phone was in his hands. And silence, once again, was the first to speak. He held out the phone without saying anything. She took it. She saw the screen. The name. The message. She froze for a few seconds. Then she looked at him as if unsure of what to do with her own guilt. He asked with a calmness that cut deeper than any shout, "Who is it?" She hesitated. Took a deep breath. Tried to look away, but he insisted. "You owe me this. At least this much." "True." And then she sat on the edge of the bed, her body still damp, the towel clutched to her chest, as if trying to protect herself from herself. And she confessed. She said she'd met the man months ago, at an art exhibition where she'd been invited to display her paintings. That at first it was just an exchange of ideas, a conversation about art, about inspiration. That he'd enchanted her with his words, with his spontaneous gestures, with the freedom he exuded. That he'd made her feel alive, desired, seen. Different from how she felt at home, where conversations had revolved around bills, commitments, routines. She said she hadn't planned anything, that things had simply happened. That an afternoon had turned into a kiss, and a kiss into something more. That she'd felt confused, guilty, but at the same time, alive. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. Each word was a delicately stabbed knife. She spoke with a choked voice, but she didn't try to justify herself. She simply told the bare truth, without embellishments. She said the man had disappeared out of nowhere a few days ago. That he'd stopped responding, disappeared from social media, and stopped answering calls. And that she felt lost. Empty. She said she'd thought about telling him, that she'd thought about leaving, but she'd been afraid. Afraid of losing what still existed between them. Afraid of being alone. Daniel stood up. He walked slowly to the bathroom. He washed his face. And when he returned, he simply said, "You made your choice." The next morning, she packed a small suitcase, calmly, without rushing. She left the ring on the kitchen table. She didn't shout. She didn't ask for an explanation. She simply left. She sat in the living room, her eyes fixed on the closed door, waiting for him to return. But he didn't. And when she finally summoned the courage to look for him, days later, she discovered he didn't want to talk. He withdrew from everything, even from mutual friends. He traveled for a while. He stayed off the internet. He changed his routine. And he rebuilt himself in silence. What Emily never expected was that, months later, without any contact from either of them, she would see him again. Not for a planned reunion, nor for an apology. But at a wedding. His wedding. Emily hadn't been invited. She was there by chance, accompanying a friend who was the bride's cousin. When she arrived and saw the outdoor altar, the smiling guests, the light-hearted atmosphere, she never imagined it would be him. But when the ceremony began and she saw him entering in his navy blue suit, his eyes steady, his smile calm, she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The world spun. And there, for the first time, she understood what true repentance was. The bride was serene. Beautiful. There was sweetness in her gaze. When Daniel saw her, his eyes lit up in a way she'd never seen before. Not with euphoria, but with peace. Emily couldn't bear it. She took 2 steps back, took a deep breath, and tried to leave discreetly. But he saw her. For an instant, their eyes met. He didn't look away. He kept his gaze steady, polite, unwavering. There was no anger. No longing. Only absence. A definitive absence. That night, lying in bed, Emily reread every old message. Every memory of the two of them. Every photo. Every plan. And she cried like she'd never cried before. Not just for losing him. But for realizing she'd lost him at the very moment she'd believed he'd always be there. And in that ceremony, the moment he exchanged vows with another woman, it was as if someone had ripped out every page of the story they'd written together. And started over from scratch. Without her. This was the true punishment. Not public. Not scandalous. But intimate. Silent. She didn't lose Daniel to someone else. She lost him to herself. To the choices she made. To the time she wasted on someone she didn't even have the courage to stay with. And as he sealed a new life, she wallowed in the memory of everything she threw away. And the cruelest thing of all was learning that he didn't hate her. That he forgave her. But he would never love her again. And that, no one gets over it. Emily still lived in the same apartment. Paint was peeling in corners of the wall, brushes were gathering dust in the makeshift studio, and the plants on the balcony had long since dried out from lack of care. Time seemed to have stopped inside those rooms, as if the house had also mourned all that had been lost. Mornings were now silent, almost cruel. The coffee that had once been made for two grew cold in the cup. The paintings hanging in the living room, which had once seemed alive, were now nothing more than memories fixed in empty frames. The absence wasn't just of a body, but of life as she knew it. Emily woke every day carrying the weight of having thrown away the only place where she had been loved completely, without demands, without pressure, with presence and constancy. She tried to move on. She tried to seek refuge in old friendships, tried to reconnect with her family, went to therapy for a while, even believed she could start over. But there was no ground left. Not after seeing with her own eyes what she had lost forever. Daniel got married and moved to a new neighborhood. His new wife brought a kind of love into his life he didn't know he needed, lightness. It wasn't unbridled passion, nor adolescent euphoria. It was emotional stability. It was deep respect. She knew his past, knew what he'd faced, and never wanted to compete with the scars. She simply offered care. And Daniel learned that true love doesn't need adrenaline to be intense. He began to smile more easily, sleep more peacefully, and look to the future without the fear of falling apart again. They had a son 2 years later, a boy who inherited his father's serene gaze and his mother's quiet courage. Their home was a routine, but a desired routine, built on dialogue, trust, and reciprocity. He never spoke of Emily with bitterness. When her name surfaced in some distant memory, he would simply fall silent for a moment and then change the subject. Not out of contempt, but because there was nothing else there worth the space. The man Emily had been involved with back then, the lover who vanished without a trace, never appeared again. There were no messages, no explanations, no unexpected reunions. He left as he had come, quick, empty, disposable. No depth, no real connection. Just a momentary escape from a life she, for some reason, found monotonous. For a long time, Emily tried to find him, not to reconnect, but to understand. She searched online, asked about mutual friends, even considered hiring him as an excuse for one last conversation. But he disappeared as if he'd never existed. And that hurt even more. Knowing she'd destroyed an entire marriage for someone who discarded her as lightly as he'd seduced her. On birthdays, she would text Daniel. Not with the goal of winning him back, but out of habit. He read it, but didn't respond. She knew he saw it. She knew that on the other side of the screen, there was a meaningful silence. A silence that said, "I've forgiven you, but I'm not coming back." Forgiveness was all that remained. But it would never be a return ticket. On one of their wedding anniversaries, years later, she passed by the restaurant where they had celebrated their first year together. She sat alone at one of the tables outside and ordered the same wine as before. The waiter recognized her. He asked about him. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and told him he was happy, as he deserved. That was the first time she truly accepted that she had lost him. Her pain wasn't blatant. It was subtle. A constant tightness in her chest. A regret that never let up. The betrayal had broken more than marriage vows. It had shattered what was most precious, the image he had of her. And that image, once shattered, could never be rebuilt. Emily began to live introspectively. She painted less. She avoided places where they might run into each other. And when someone she knew commented on his new life, she would just smile and say, "He deserved this from the start, I just didn't see it." Time passed. The wound healed, but it left marks. Marks no one could see, but which she carried in her tired eyes and trembling hands. Sometimes, while washing the dishes or walking through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, she felt flashes of memory, his touch, his laughter in the car during a road trip, the way he tucked her in on cold nights. It all came back like an old movie, only with the sound muted. Because now, all that remained was silence. Daniel moved on with his life with dignity. He made love a conscious choice. He didn't let the past make him bitter. On the contrary, he became even kinder, more mature, more present. He never used pain as a weapon. He never exposed Emily. He never told anyone the details of the betrayal. He kept everything to himself, as part of a story that shaped him, but didn't define him. And that made him even more admirable. His wife knew the story and respected the space he needed to rebuild himself. The son grew up listening to his father talk about love as something built day by day, not something dependent on impulses. And perhaps, that was the true happy ending. Emily continued to walk through life, but without any spark. She had brief, superficial relationships. She tried to fall in love again, but no one saw her the way Daniel once did. No one offered the same calm, the same shelter. One day, during one of those long, sleepless nights, she wrote in her diary, "Sometimes the punishment isn't losing someone, it's knowing you'll never be looked at the same way again." She finally understood that betrayal isn't just an act. It's a sentence. One that is carried out silently, day after day. And so the story ended. With him at peace. With her repentant. With time doing what it always does, putting everyone where they choose to be. There's no shouting, no revenge. Just the relentless reality of the consequences. Betrayal destroyed a home. It destroyed love. It destroyed respect. And, above all, it destroyed the betrayer themselves. Because those who betray may move on, but they never return to who they were. If you've made it this far, tell us, what did you think of this story? Do you think she deserved forgiveness? Or that he was right to move on without looking back? Leave your opinion in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll always find real, intense stories that speak directly to the heart. Remember, betrayal isn't just a mistake, it's a choice. And choices have consequences. They destroy families, hearts, lives. That's why, here on this channel, we never, ever, condone any kind of betrayal. Let this story serve as a warning. A reminder that true love doesn't survive lies. And that sometimes, the worst pain, is realizing too late what you've lost.